This is East Asia Tonight.
Good Friday evening, and we'll tell you what's tonight's top stories from East Asia. A double milestone in South Korea. 80 years since liberation from Japan and the inauguration of President Lee Jae Myung, who pledges to scale back military activity along the border with North Korea. Tokyo as well marks World War II's end with a tribute, honoring more than 3 million lives lost. Japan's Prime Minister and Emperor vow to uphold peace amid growing fears the past is being forgotten. And just hours to go before the high-stakes Trump-Putin summit in Alaska. The U.S. president optimistic about a deal to end the Russia-Ukraine war, but warns that there is a 25% chance it could fall through. China's growth falters across the board, with weak domestic consumption weighing on measures to boost spending. Ahead on East Asia Tonight, watch robots race, play football, table tennis as China kicks off its inaugural humanoid robot games. And an exhibition in Hangzhou is celebrating ugly products that are ringing the till to the tune of millions of dollars in online sales for Taobao. South Korean President Lee Jae Myung has vowed to respect the North's political system and build what he calls military trust, a day after Pyongyang said it had no interest in improving ties. Now, Mr. Lee was speaking at an event marking the anniversary of South Korea's liberation from Japanese rule. He said he wants to end some military activities along his country's border with the North and restore a de-escalation agreement signed by the two sides in 2018, which has since broken down. Well, the South Korean president has pledged to reach out to Pyongyang and pursue dialogue without preconditions since his election in June. The neighbors remain technically at war.
현재 북측의 체제를 존중하고 어떠한 형태의 흡수 통일도 추구하지 않을 것이며 일체의 적대 행위를 할 뜻도 없음을 분명히 밝힙니다.
Pyongyang had rejected all of Seoul's recent peace overtures. On Thursday, the North Korean leader's sister, Kim Yo-jong, called these moves a pipe dream, saying that her country has no intention of improving ties with South Korea. CNA's Lee Jae-myung joins us now live from Seoul. So Yoon-suk, President Lee there, he's vowed to restore relations with North Korea, but just how realistic is that pledge?
Well, we'll have to wait and see if there is any kind of reaction from North Korea. Now, since President Lee Jae Myung took office in June, he has continuously in dialogue with North Korea. But, for the last few years, there have been no contact of whatsoever between South and North Korea. And so many analysts here say that at the moment, they don't think there will be dialogue or any kind of contact between the two Koreas. But having said that, I think what's very important is that message that he gave to the North Koreans this morning when he made that speech, saying that he was going to respect and recognize North Korea as a state, and that he had no plans to pursue in the form of absorption on unification, which is in a way very different from what his predecessors has said, because all the time many analysts here and even the South Korean government had talked of unification in a way that it would be done making South and North Korea unified, but in the South Korean way and with the South Korean way of running the country. And so many analysts here are saying that it is very important that President Lee Jae Myung made that statement that he was going to recognize and see North Korea as it is, and that there would be no absorption unification, as we have seen, from his predecessors' speeches in the past. And so it'll be interesting to see if North Korea will come forward, though many analysts here say they don't think that will be happening. We have seen President Lee Jae Myung taking, many actions in the last few months, like stopping the propaganda loudspeakers along the border. He's also taken down those loudspeakers along the border, too. we have seen some kind of action from North Korea where he did stop those loudspeakers, propaganda information coming out from North Korea into South Korea. But we haven't seen North Korea dismantle any of its loudspeakers along the border too. And in fact, as you said, that statement that came out from Kim Yo-jong, the powerful sister of Kim Jong-un, does show that North Korea at the moment has no intention at all of improving inter-Korean ties. And many analysts here say it really will depend on talks between the United States and North Korea before there can be any improvement in inter-Korean relations.
And so President Lee, he also made another interesting point about forging mutually beneficial ties with Japan while urging Tokyo to reflect on its historical wrongs. So with the two leaders, they're expected to meet in Japan next week. What can we expect in terms of Seoul-Tokyo relations moving forward?
Well, I think what is going to come out of that summit meeting on August 23rd between the leaders of South Korea and Japan will be very important, and it could be a signal as to where this relations between the two countries will go. Many analysts here are saying it is important to note that Lee Jae Myung, President Lee, is making that trip to Japan before he goes to Washington. He will be leaving for Washington, but after that summit with the Prime Minister Ishiba in Japan. And so many analysts here are saying that South Korea is seeing Japan as a significant partner. But having said that, too, he did say at that speech this morning that it was important for the Japanese government to recognize its past wrongdoings, the painful history that South Korea had to go through while it was under Japan's colonial rule. But at the same time, that South Korea was willing to move these relations forward. But however, the South Korean government did put out a statement today saying that it was expressing disappointment and disbelief that the Japanese government officials, some of them had visited the war shrine because Liberation Day is being celebrated here in South Korea, and many South Koreans still have this bitter sentiments against the Japanese for the harsh colonial rule, and many don't think that Japanese officials should be visiting the war shrine when the two countries are trying to improve relations and trying to really put the historical past behind them and move the relations forward. So we'll have to see what comes out of this summit meeting on August 23rd. But many analysts here are saying that South Korean President Lee Jae Myung does realize the significance of really, having that closer ties with Japan, especially with this upcoming summit meeting in Washington, and also the two countries when they meet on August 23rd, apart from the bilateral relations, we'll definitely be talking about the recent U.S. Tariffs that were imposed on both countries, but also we'll be talking about the security situation around the region and around the world as this trilateral coordination with Japan, South Korea, and the United States are very important for the security here on the Korean Peninsula.
Many thanks for that report. CNA's Lee Jae-myung live from Seoul. Now, across the border, North Korea also marked Liberation Day, highlighting its relations with Russia. Well, state media released a letter from leader Kim Jong-un to the Russian President Vladimir Putin, saying their relations have reached full bloom. Mr. Kim also wished Mr. Putin and the Russian military victory and glory. The Russian leader wrote back, calling North Korean troops sent to fight in Ukraine heroic. Moscow and Pyongyang have grown closer in recent years, signing a mutual defense pact last year during Mr. Putin's visit. North Korea on Thursday held a major ceremony at Pyongyang's Arch of Triumph to mark the end of Japanese occupation. Kim Jong-un was accompanied by the Speaker of Russia's lower house of parliament as a crowd looked on. Separately, a Russian delegation is in Pyongyang to celebrate the anniversary. North Korea typically highlights its ties with Russia on this day in recognition of Moscow's role in a nation's liberation. Soviet troops surged into northern areas of the Korean peninsula in August 1945 and has helped to end decades of Japanese colonial rule. Well, Japan today marks the 80th anniversary of its surrender in World War II. The conflict remains a source of tension today, especially with its neighbors, South Korea and China. A moment of silence rippled through Tokyo's Budokan Hall this morning. Emperor Naruhito and Empress Masako led the solemn event alongside the Japanese premier. Both emphasized the need to pursue peace as the country reflects on its dark past.
戦中戦後の苦難を今後とも語り継ぎ、私たち皆で心を合わせ、将来にわたって平和と人々の幸せを希求し続けていくことを心から願います。
戦争の惨禍を決して繰り返さない、進む道を二度と間違えない、あの戦争の反省と教訓を今改めて深く胸に刻まねばなりません。
Separately, dozens of lawmakers from Japan visited the Yasukuni shrine, with Agriculture Minister Shinjiro Koizumi among them. Visits to this shrine by politicians regularly stir anger among Japan's neighbors as it pays tribute to some 3 million war dead, including convicted war criminals. For more, we are joined by CNA's Michio Ishida, and she is speaking to us from Tokyo. Mitch, it has been 80 years since Japan's surrender in World War II. I imagine the mood must be somber at a memorial like this.
Well, Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba used the word regret in his speech. It's actually for the first time since the word was removed from the war memorial speech of a prime minister since Shinzo Abe in 2013, when he indicated that Japan had to move on with, the next generation not having experienced the war. Mr. Ishiba said, "We will never take the wrong path. We should, from the depths of our heart, regret the war and learn a lesson from it." Now, Emperor Naruhito addressed the war dead, stressing the need that the war, post-war period are remembered and conveyed for generations to come. Now, the war memorial this time had no spouses of war deaths. There were 3,400 family members attending. Children of the war dead are falling, and 67% were war dead's children in 2008 attending the ceremony. Now it's just 38.5%. I actually met a 98-year-old who lost his brother in the war, and he said that he does not convey the tragedy of the war to his grandchildren. And I also met children accompanying their grandparents at the memorial service, and they shared their thoughts with me. So here they are.
ほとんど話したことはありません。もうね、そんな話してもね、なんか関心持ちません。
なんかその原爆とかですごい被害者が出て、すごく悲しい戦争だったっていうことを小学校とかで教わりました。
国のために自分の身を挺して戦ったことがすごいとも思うし、とても辛いなと思いました。
Well, Michio, it's been decades on. We heard some of the sentiment earlier, but what is the general feeling in Japan when it comes to the war?
Well, in a nationwide survey by NHK conducted this year, 93% said they have not experienced the war. 58% said they have heard accounts of the war directly from witnesses, while 40% say they never had. Now, on the question of whether it was a war of invasion by Japan and Asian countries, 35% said it was, while 48% said they were not sure. On the reality of a nuclear attack and its impact, 55% said they were not informed much, and that's even though Japan's the only country that has faced nuclear bomb attacks. Now, August is a month when local media go big on war-related stories, but there are less war victims who can tell their stories. Most are very old if they're alive. The Japanese also tend to take peace for granted, renouncing war under its pacifist constitution. And meanwhile, as you mentioned earlier, prime minister candidates visited the war shrine or Yasukuni shrine. They include Agriculture Minister Shinjiro Koizumi, former Economic Security Minister Sanae Takaichi. It's a controversial war shrine with Class A war criminals enshrined.
Oh, many thanks for that report. CNA's Michio Ishida live from Tokyo. Meantime, the Chinese embassy in Japan has slammed Japanese politicians' visit to the Yasukuni shrine. The embassy says the visit reflects the, quote, lingering ghosts of Tokyo's militarism. China's top diplomat Wang Yi did not comment directly on the visits, but called on Japan to face up to history and learn from it. He also urged Tokyo to make, quote, the right choice. Mr. Wang said certain segments in Japan are denying the country's actions during the war and continue to glorify the past. Taiwan's president has emphasized the importance of freedom and democracy, warning that aggression will end in failure as the self-ruled island marks the anniversary of the end to the Second World War. Now, in a post on Facebook, Taiwanese President William Lai says unity will lead to victory and described the war as a stark reminder to the world that peace is priceless and there are no winners. This comes as Taiwan bans its government officials from attending a military parade planned by Beijing, set to take place on 3rd of September to mark the anniversary of the end of World War II. Authorities warn that former officials who attend could face penalties, including the revocation of pensions. A time now for a break. But coming up on East Asia tonight, Japan averts a technical recession as domestic spending powers the economy past the threat of tariffs. And the Trump administration reportedly in talks with Intel to have the U.S. government potentially take a stake in the struggling chipmaker. Hello there. Great to have your company on East Asia tonight. It is now time for business news with none other than Olivia Mazuki. So, Liv, let's talk about China's growth. Apparently, it's undershooting expectations in July.
Yes, so there's a cocktail of factors there, I'll tell you, but a 4-year slowdown in the housing market and also the Trump tariffs among the factors weighing down on the second largest economy in the world. Growth fell across the board as weak domestic demand persisted, and Beijing intensified efforts to curb excess capacity. Industrial output that rose 5.7% on year, hitting an 8-month low. Retail sales also slowed sharply to 3.7%. Fixed asset investment that grew by a modest 1.6% in the first 7 months of the year, while property investment registered a double-digit percentage drop of 12%. All of these indicators missed Bloomberg estimates. A spokesperson for China's Statistics Bureau said more efforts are needed to ensure economic recovery.
在提振消费专项行动带动下，消费扩大的态势没有改变，消费新动能持续壮大。但也要看到外部不稳定、不确定因素增多，国内居民消费能力和信心仍待提升，消费内生的动力仍待增强。
The country's drawn-out housing market crunch continues to drag on growth. New figures showed falling property prices and shrinking construction. Employment and unemployment that ticked up as millions of new graduates entered a subdued labor market. The data highlights weakening domestic consumption and the threat of U.S. tariffs. A temporary trade truce with Washington has helped Chinese businesses avoid the worst threats of levies, but Chinese manufacturers still face subdued demand at home and factory gate deflation domestically. China's top leaders held back from announcing any significant new stimulus measures in July. Experts say policymakers will need to revisit their cautious stance and to keep this year's 5% target growth within reach. One analyst explained China's approach of slowly boosting consumption.
So consumer confidence is very, very important. And you've seen the various policies in terms of consumption subsidies that have come in. Now, those are maybe not the big bang that people were expecting, but they have been growing in terms of their scope and then their size. So it's a sort of gradualist approach. And we've now got recently, in the past few days, interest subsidies on service consumption and also to service industries. So I think that's how we should see that there is support there and it will get expanded if needed. So I think for the past year and a half, maybe a couple of years, there's definitely been a line drawn under how bad things can be. And so the consumption stimulus efforts are one of them. This latest focus on supply side capacity is another one. So the economy has got challenges, but I think there is definitely a focus to ensure that there is stability and their growth target is one that is ultimately achieved.
Upbeat figures from Japan. The economy there grew faster than expected in Q2 as export volumes held up well against new U.S. tariffs. GDP expanded an annualized 1% on quarter, marking the fifth straight quarter of expansion after the previous quarter's contraction was revised to growth. Business spending exceeded forecasts while private consumption edged higher. Now, the data is the first to reflect U.S. auto tariffs and the so-called reciprocal levies. The GDP reading also strengthens the case for the Bank of Japan to withdraw monetary stimulus. It recently gave a less gloomy outlook for the economy after Japan reached a trade deal with the U.S. The scorecard also offers some relief to Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, who are facing calls to resign following his coalition majority loss in the upper house election last month. However, analysts warn global economic uncertainties fueled by U.S. tariffs could weigh on the world's fourth largest economy in the coming months. A Nikkei analysis suggests major Japanese firms' earnings taking a $23.6 billion hit for the fiscal year due to U.S. tariffs. Export-heavy autos, electrical equipment and machinery sectors among the most vulnerable. A combined operating profit of 41 companies is forecast to drop 18% on year to some $83 billion for the financial year ending March 2026. The $23 billion impact is equivalent to nearly a third of expected combined profit with the inclusion of Nissan Motor. Without the impact of tariffs, profit for the firms would have risen 3% to $105 billion. Japanese businesses are not playing down the effect of U.S. levies just yet, despite a trade deal struck last month. Duties on Japanese autos have been lowered to 15% from 27.5%, but they are substantially higher than the 2.5% levy in place before Trump's tariff war. A Toyota executive says, while the effect of U.S. trade measures is not as large as initially thought, it will still have a severe impact on results. SoftBank founder Masayoshi Son is riding a fresh AI wave, adding some $9 billion to his fortune in just 2 weeks of this month. And this comes as gains from SoftBank shares hit a record high on the back of its AI investments. Mr. Son's net worth now stands at $31.3 billion, making him Japan's second richest person after Uniqlo founder Tadashi Yanai. SoftBank's flagship Vision Fund has rebounded, lifted by asset sales, including part of T-Mobile stake. Mr. Son has also ramped up his investments in AI hardware, buying shares in NVIDIA and TSMC in the March quarter. SoftBank shares are rising also on the news of the company is behind the purchase of Foxconn's EV plant in Ohio, a move linked to its $500 billion Stargate data center project with OpenAI and Oracle. Mr. Son's wealth has fluctuated sharply over the years, but his latest AI ventures are now boosting both his personal fortune and SoftBank's stock. Shares jumped 6.4% today, taking their year-to-date gain to 78%. And the U.S. government is reportedly in talks with Intel for a stake in the struggling chip maker. If successful, the deal would add to a growing list of U.S. President Trump's interventions in American industries seen as essential to national security. According to a Bloomberg report, the potential deal will help fund the embattled chip maker's planned factory in Ohio, which had once been touted as the world's largest chip-making facility. Now, details of the stake and price are still being discussed. Both the White House and Intel did not confirm the deal. The plan comes after a meeting between Mr. Trump and Intel CEO Lip-Bu Tan following the U.S. leader's demand that Tan resigns from the top job. This over his alleged investment ties to the Chinese military. Once a former leading chip maker, Intel has fallen down the ranks in recent years. It has struggled to make inroads in the booming AI chip sector dominated by NVIDIA, and it's facing heavy losses from contract manufacturing ambitions. Intel shares ended the day surging by more than 7% and are more than 2% in the pre-market trading. And that's all I have in business. Happy Friday, Ateli.
Appreciate that. Thanks so much, Olivia. Enjoy your weekend. Right, on that note, we're going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, South Korean President Lee Jae Myung set for his official inauguration in a ceremony that will take place in about half an hour's time. And beyond East Asia, Russia's delegation arrives in Alaska for a high-stakes summit with the U.S. The war in Ukraine on agenda. You're watching East Asia tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. The U.S. president is upbeat ahead of his high-stakes summit with Russia's Vladimir Putin, but he is admitting there's a 25% chance a deal to end the Russia-Ukraine war could fail. The Japanese leaders vow to maintain peace 80 years after the end of World War II, but the conflict remains a source of tension in East Asia today. And South Korea's new president says he respects the North's political system and wants to restore a 2018 military pact with Pyongyang. Today marks not only 80 years since South Korea's independence from colonial Japan, it's also the day President Lee Jae Myung is sworn into office. Well, crowds are filling Gwanghwamun Square in downtown Seoul, where 6,500 police officers are on duty and traffic is restricted. The ceremony will begin in less than half an hour from now at 8 p.m. local time. Well, dozens of rallies are planned nearby, including one that's expected to draw 10,000 people, led by a far-right pastor opposed to the new Liberal administration. For more on this, CNA's Lee Jae-Myung, she joins us once again from Gwanghwamun Square in Seoul. So Yoon-suk, we know that South Korea just moments away from officially swearing in Lee Jae Myung as president. Walk us through the atmosphere. What's it like?
Well, yes, it's really a ceremony where the people will be appointing President Lee Jae Myung as their president. And I am here in Gwanghwamun Square where the roads have been closed off. And as you can see behind me, there have been people gathering here all day. And now, right now, we are just less than half an hour from where the ceremony will be starting. If I can explain a bit what's going to happen here, very soon we'll be seeing like 80 people's representatives. And these are people from different walks of life, including achievers, people who've been fighting for democracy, the economy, the culture, sports, and everyday citizens who've been serving the community here in South Korea. And they will be carrying a personally written appointment certificate, which they will be placing one by one into a large cube in the center of that stage. Now, after that, then President Lee Jae Myung and the First Lady will be joining that final group of representatives, and they will be also putting that final appointment letter into that cube, and we will be seeing once that is done, we'll be seeing the cube light up with this appointment of light ceremony coming to an end before President Lee Jae Myung gives a speech thanking the people here for gathering here today. Now, as you can see behind me, there are those people, but you can also see the security here because security has been beefed up around this Gwanghwamun area. Because there have been protests going on all day here, really, across here in central Seoul. In fact, there are several being planned and several ongoing now around this Gwanghwamun area, and that's why more than 7,000 security personnel have been deployed around this area, and especially by that conservative, by that pastor, and they're saying that more than 10,000 are expected to gather for that protest rally, as many as those people who have gathered here for this ceremony, and that's why the security here is tight, but everyone here is really waiting for President Lee Jae Myung to appear for the ceremony to begin.
So, Yoon-suk, speaking of those vocal opponents against Mr. Lee, conservative lawmakers say they would not attend because of this particular incident where the Lee administration, they pardoned former Justice Minister Cho Kuk, who had been jailed for fabricating academic records just to help his children enter these prestigious schools. Tell us more about this particular pardon and how that has been affecting the already polarized politics scene?
Well, yes, in a way, many critics here have been saying that that really is one of the controversial issues here in South Korea. And in fact, among the attendees here were supposed to be the former conservative leaders, including former President Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye. But both of them have declined to attend this ceremony, together with the members of the opposition party, the conservative opposition party, because of many reasons. And one of that is because of the release of Cho Guk. Now, Cho Guk used to be the justice minister, but also a very close ally of former President Moon Jae-in. And he was detained and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for fabricating documents allowing his children to enter a prestigious university here in South Korea. And he was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but he was released under the special amnesty that President Lee Jae Myung carried out. And he was among the more than 2,000 people who were released on this Liberation Day. And that is the whole controversial that's going on here in South Korea. Many feel that perhaps he shouldn't have been released. He only served about 8 months in prison. And that is one of the reasons why many of the conservative leaders and the conservative groups are not attending this ceremony here too. But having said that, apart from that big protest rally by that pastor, there are also small and large rallies that's been happening here all day. And in fact, some happening right now. And they are also by the labor groups in South Korea who also say they refuse to attend the ceremony. And that's why many critics here are saying that they're calling this a half-people ceremony. And despite pledges and despite, President Lee Jae Myung saying that he wanted to unite this polarized nation, many are here feel that he is not, really carrying out the actions, although he stays saying those words. Although President Lee Jae Myung has said he wanted to release Cho Guk because he felt that it was time to put the political wounds to heal them. Many critics saying that the fact that he has released Cho Guk ahead of his time in prison has not done that, but has really polarized this nation forward. And so, despite President Lee Jae Myung saying that it is necessary and it is significant that this country come together because we have seen how polarized it is, many critics say that what he has been doing the last 3 months since he took office has not really shown that he is sincere about that. And, as you remember that we have his predecessor, the former President Yoon Suk-yeol, and even the First Lady, who are behind bars now, the first time ever here in South Korea for a former South Korean president and the former First Lady to be put behind bars. And so that is also another issue that many of the conservatives have cited as the reason as to why they say they cannot attend this ceremony. And it's going to be very difficult in a way, for President Lee Jae Myung to try and unite this country if, as critics say, if that's the actions and if that's what he's going to be doing in the coming months.
I hear what you're saying. Well, thanks so very much for that report. Lee Myung-suk reporting to us live from Seoul. Russia's delegation has started arriving in Alaska for a high-stakes summit with America. U.S. President Donald Trump is optimistic that his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, is ready to make a deal on Ukraine when they meet. Well, the U.S. leader, however, cautioned that there is a 25% chance the talks could fail. Well, it gets underway in about 9 hours from now.
I think that President Putin would like to see a deal. I think if I weren't president, he would take over all of Ukraine. It's a war that should have never happened. If I weren't president, in my opinion, he would much rather take over all of Ukraine. But I am president, and he's not going to mess around with me.
Russia's leader, meantime, welcomed U.S. peace efforts, seeing them as a pathway to a new nuclear arms control pact.
Американская администрация сегодняшняя, которая, как всем хорошо известно, предпринимает, на мой взгляд, достаточно энергичные и искренние усилия для того, чтобы прекратить боевые действия, прекратить кризис и выйти на договоренности, представляющие интерес для всех вовлеченных в этот конфликт сторон.
Well, the Kremlin has said that no joint statement is expected from the Alaska summit. For more, Dasha Chernyshova, she joins us live from Moscow. Dasha, as the sit-down between President Trump and Putin nears just hours away, what can we expect from the discussions given the previous failed negotiations?
Well, we understand that Moscow is willing to convey its position, which it says it has already been trying to outline to the U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff when he was sitting down with the Russian leadership at the Kremlin. And Moscow is actually saying that there is a very good thing that is happening between the sides now. That is the desire and political will to resolve the complex issues through dialogue. So the Russian authorities are saying that indeed Ukraine issue will be taken central stage in these upcoming negotiations, but also they say there is immense potential for the economic and trade cooperation between Russia and the United States, as well as the possibility of looking into the wider issues of the security architecture, such as strategic armaments and the possible extension of the New START treaty. So a lot is on the agenda, but at the same time, we understand that they are in Moscow, the officials are trying to not to inflate any expectations for these upcoming meetings, suggesting that obviously there are many complex issues that will have to be solved, and it is quite unclear whether the sides will be able to resolve those in just one meeting. And Moscow has previously said that they hope the next meeting between the leaders might be taking place on the Russian territory.
Now, Mr. Trump, I mean, we hear that he has warned of severe consequences if Russia fails to a ceasefire. But from Moscow's perspective, I mean, are they really under pressure to settle?
Well, we understand that Moscow has not changed its position when it comes to its red lines, and it was outlined back in 2024 in June when the Russian president was saying that what is needed for peace in Ukraine is the withdrawal of the Ukrainian troops from Donbas and the areas which Moscow now considers as its own territories. Those are the 4 former regions of Ukraine. And it is quite unclear whether territorial swaps, as President Trump has previously suggested, will be discussed in these upcoming talks. Obviously, Russia is saying that it is not fearing the new sanctions, stressing that its economy has adapted to those. But for many in Russia, it is clear that this summit is crucial, and that will be very important for the sides to understand the positions. And also, Moscow has been previously saying that for such a summit to take place, there have also to be done some groundwork, and the hope is that some sort of agreements will be reached. But also, the Kremlin has previously said that they are not expecting any documents to be signed. So again, the clear picture at this stage is that the sides will have to negotiate many complex issues and to agree at least on some sort of a framework for further steps for this summit to succeed.
It'll be interesting to see what comes out of that summit. Thank you so very much for that report. Dasha Chernyshova speaking to us from Moscow. A break's next, but coming up on East Asia tonight, talks over 10 days for the first legally binding treaty to tackle global plastic pollution runs into roadblock. And we dive into the weird and wonderful world of ugly things that are selling like hotcakes online. Malaysian billionaire Ong Beng Seng has been fined 30,000 Singapore dollars for abetting former Singapore Transport Minister S.S. Warren in obstructing justice. He was not given a jail term due to his poor health. Geraldine Yap has the details.
Arriving at the state courts once again, escorted by his staff and lawyers, property tycoon Ong Beng Seng navigated the media scrum slowly without addressing questions from reporters. The 79-year-old Malaysian had pleaded guilty to 1 count of abetting the obstruction of justice by arranging for former Singapore Transport Minister S.S. Warren to repay the cost of a business-class flight in late 2022 from Doha to Singapore. The hearing started slightly earlier than scheduled, with Principal District Judge Lee Jae Myung outlining the central question in this case, whether the exercise of judicial mercy is warranted due to Ong's advanced multiple myeloma, an incurable form of blood cancer. Judge Lee said there was clear and undisputed medical evidence that jail time would increase the risk of endangering Ong's life. In particular, she said the risk of infection would increase significantly due to unavoidable interactions with rotating shifts of prison officers and medical staff. The risk of falls would also be heightened, as Ong would face disorientation in an unfamiliar environment and different routines without his usual caregivers.
Judge Lee noted that while the Singapore Prison Service has an adequate healthcare system in place to manage inmates with serious and complex medical conditions, this does not address the enhanced risk of potentially fatal infections and falls. Ong's defense team had included in their submissions to the court reports from his doctors stating that he needs to continue to receive the same standard of care and access to his specialist medical team.
Therefore, Judge Lee agreed with the prosecution and defense that judicial mercy was justified and imposed a fine of 30,000 Singapore dollars, the maximum amount a district court is allowed to give. She said the appropriate sentence for Ong would otherwise have been 3 months jail after taking into consideration his early guilty plea and lower culpability. Judge Lee noted that one might consider it unfair that an offender who can afford a higher standard of healthcare is better positioned to avoid jail time than someone less privileged. She said this view is misguided, and the critical question is whether imprisonment would create heightened risks to an offender's life. If a lower standard of healthcare in prison would not result in significantly higher risks, then she said there is no basis for exercising judicial mercy. After the sentencing, Ong paid the fine and left the state courts without stopping to speak to the media, only giving a brief wave.
Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto has highlighted key achievements in his first State of the Nation address since taking office. He hailed the country's faster-than-expected economic growth, his signature free meals program, and a crackdown on corruption. CNA's Saiful Bari Ismail has more.
In his State of the Nation address, President Prabowo took the chance to showcase his achievements since taking office last October, putting the spotlight on his flagship free nutritious meal program. He said the program has now reached around 20 million people, from students to pregnant women, breastfeeding mothers and toddlers across Indonesia. He praised the National Nutrition Agency for what he called extraordinary work, saying Indonesia has achieved in months what other countries take years to accomplish. For him, the free meal program is not just social assistance, it's an investment in producing a smarter, healthier future generation. The initiative was one of the biggest campaign promises aimed at improving children's nutrition and boosting long-term education outcomes. But it hasn't been without problems. More than a dozen food poisoning cases have been reported since its launch. Authorities say they are tightening procedures, from ensuring higher quality ingredients to reducing cooking and delivery times. Mr. Prabowo also defended his austerity measures starting 2025 with a massive 306 trillion rupiah or nearly $19 billion spending cut. He said the money has been used more productively and can be felt by the people. Still, critics argue the cuts are poorly timed, poorly designed and lack a clear justification. Mr. Prabowo's first annual budget speech will set the tone for next year's state spending. A blueprint the government says is aimed at strengthening Indonesia's food and energy sovereignty while building economic resilience and a long-term prosperity. Now, one thing to watch, whether he updates the full-year forecast for the economy. Last week, the government reported GDP growth of 5.12% in the second quarter, up from 4.87% in the first. The 2026 budget is also expected to factor in the 19% US import tariff on Indonesian goods, part of a recent trade deal with Washington. While the rate is still high, it's lower than what many other countries face, giving Indonesian exporters an edge in the American market. But critics warn of the trade-off. US goods can now enter Indonesia duty-free, raising fears of pressure on local industries.
In other news, negotiations on a landmark treaty to tackle plastic pollution at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva have ended without a consensus. Well, despite all that effort to break the deadlock, including extending the deadline, delegates remain split on how ambitious the agreement should be. 5 rounds of negotiations over the past 3 years have yet to yield a deal. Now, a key sticking point was whether the treaty should limit the production of new plastic or focus only on better design, recycling and reuse. The European Union and many African and Latin American states want to cut plastic production and phase out of toxic chemicals. But oil-producing nations oppose production limits and want the treaty to focus only on waste management. China kicked off a 3-day-long World Humanoid Robot Games today, showing off its advances in AI and robotics with teams from 16 countries. Well, the robots raced, played table tennis, and tackled robot-specific challenges, from sorting medicines to cleaning services. Teams came from the US, Germany, and Brazil, with nearly 200 representing universities and 88 from private companies. Now, they also played football, which organizers say help train robots' coordination abilities, useful for assembly line operations that require collaboration between multiple units. Well, that coordination is still a work in progress for some of the contestants, but still needed a fair bit of help from the human creators for now. Staying in China, an exhibition is celebrating the world of weird and wonderful things for sale online. Now, can you guess what this is? Well, it's just one of hundreds of products on show at the Hangzhou exhibition. They've won or been shortlisted for Taobao's Uglies Award this year. Organizers at the e-commerce giant say the turnout has beat expectations, with more than 3,000 visitors a day. The gag gifts may look like a joke, but the sales are serious business. Ugly products on Taobao have generated nearly $14 million in sales since 2020, according to Alibaba. Exhibition organizers say the growing popularity of ugly stuff is driven by younger consumers who want to express their individuality. Beauty may be in the eye of the beholder, but ugly is already in the shopping cart.
近年来，情绪消费变得越来越蓝海，变得越来越受欢迎，它变成了一个新的赛道啊。然后我们是怎么来考虑这件事情呢？我们提炼了一句话，叫做美是规训，丑是自由；美是标准答案，丑是参差多态。
我进来看的时候呢，还发现它还蛮有创意的。
And that wraps up this Friday's edition of East Asia Tonight. And don't forget your headlines anytime at CNA.Asia. Thanks for watching.